Good afternoon, one and all. Good to see everybody again and hear the nice buzz of conversation as we enter our last session here at this wonderful conference. It's the poem is Sacrament, and it's the plenary address of Dr. Albert Gelpi. I have just a couple of I statements to share with you before I begin my brief, I promise, Al, brief, introduction of Albert Gelpi. I confess here publicly a great secret. I believe more in majoring in professors than I do in subjects. And yes, I know I love ideas, we all love ideas, but I can do it both end. I love ideas and people, and the relationships are more dear to me. So I can also share with you that I got fully Gelpi'd in graduate school. I was able to take a course with Barbara Gelpi where we talked about decadence and Catholicism, and Chesterton and Flannery O'Connor's feminism, which was an adventure. And Barbara was a superior teacher, and that's a fond memory. I have a fond memory of working with Father Donald Gelpi, who is a rare and unique American theologian, one of the most original thinkers, I think, to have lived in the last 100 years, especially as an American theologian, Donald Gelpi of blessed memory. I got to study with Al, and when I told my friend Matt Lusky about Al Gelpi, Matt was working at University of Oregon on Gene Toomer's pamphlets, modernist pamphlets, a small, and Matt said, "Oh, great, Murph, again, you know, God is with you, or grace is with you, however you put it. Al Gelpi is the dean of American poetry." I said, "Oh, I have that going for me, don't I, Matt?" And so, really a grace, and it's been a grace. So neither the well-crafted biography that's of Al in the pamphlet, beautiful pamphlet, nor my remarks will ever describe what Al has done for American letters, really global letters. Not only as a critical writer, teacher, but as an editor. You know, as an editor, Al is a superior editor. So I just wanted to share with you 3 little points to kind of share with you as I introduce Al, things that I honor in both Al and Clan Gelpi. So the first thing I'll say is generosity. Al is a member of my dissertation committee. Imagine having one of the world's premier editors being on your committee. And then to have a unique, humane sense of giving, right? So the readings of my dissertation, my rough amateurish work, were so carefully commented upon over and over again. Imagine that. I will forever be thankful for that attention, Al. Thank you. I repay that in kind, I hope, by being that way with my students. So. Secondly, I learned about dialogue. Dialogue was always kind of a spineless word for me until I met Al and Barbara and Donald particularly. Dialogue is kind of sacramental. And to have intimate companionship about the things that move us as they do, and to share that together is something special, especially in this professional context, which can be kind of rough, academia. And so to live that, to see it, and really Al and Barbara together, the dialogue they had as a couple, when we'd have dinner and with my family, my wife and I learned how to be a better married family person. That modeling was very dear to me. And every time we had dinner at Al and Barbara, I said, I bring the kids, don't bring the kids. It didn't matter. It was never an issue. It's a big tent with the Gelpis. So I thank you for that. I remember too, so often Donald and Al, they would dig out their copper cups from the Jefferson administration and sip gin and talk about Catholic identity politics with nothing but laughter. And that's fun for me as we move into a great dinner. There's a third thing always, but I'm going to leave it because there's something sacramental about a third thing. And I'm pretty sure that Al will walk that terrain and lead us. And so it's my honor to introduce Albert Gelpi, Poem and Sacrament. Thank you. Thank you all.
And you can hear me. Oh, I can hear myself, so that's good. Does everybody have the free literature? Yes, okay, good, great. Isn't it wonderful that here we are concluding our 2 days of talk about Denise on her 93rd birthday. It's just absolutely incredible. I don't know whether that happened by chance or through the power of the Holy Spirit, or...
The only time this room and that room was available in October.
No, I think maybe it was through Denise's little intervention on her own behalf. I want to join with all of us who've been up on this end of the room in thanking those who made this wonderful conference possible. Particularly Marco and Missy, maybe, yes, there you are, thank you, great. It's been an extraordinary time for all of us who've been here. As you hear when I start giving you my paper, what I have to say is going to intersect with and move out in and out of things that have been said, ideas that have been presented in earlier presentations, and even I'm be talking about a couple of poems that have come up. But I think that might not be a bad thing at the end of the conference, as a way of, I hope, pulling our 2 days together in giving them some kind of finish. I particularly think my talk is going to resonate with Kevin's opening talk, and so in our end is our beginning, as always. My paper is called The Poem as Sacrament, and I want to dedicate it to my brother Donald. Like his fellow Jesuit William Lynch, Donald was a theologian who was deeply informed and deeply inspirited by the poetry of the world. So, Donald, this is for you. The poem is Sacrament. The development of Denise Levertov's poetic career can be schematized into 3 phases. In the 1950s and early 60s, when she was most closely associated with the Black Mountain poets, there are the imagist epiphanic poems celebrating the wonder of ordinary, everyday experiences. Then in the late 60s and 70s came the poems of political protest, occasioned mostly by the Vietnam War. And finally, in the 80s and 90s, poems from an explicitly religious and Christian perspective. She correctly saw this development not in terms of shifts and changes, but in terms of a continuous progression. She called herself several times a pilgrim, and her pilgrim's path, though by no means without stresses and distresses, was guided by a clear motivating impulse. Looking back in 1984 over the way she had come, she said that, and these are her words, she said that the acknowledgement and celebration of mystery probably constitutes the most consistent theme of my poetry. The acknowledgement and celebration of the mystery in nature, in people, in the astonishing experiences of daily life. So what I want to do is follow Levertov's pilgrim's path, using her own words and looking with some attention to a few of her poems, in order to clarify her sense of mystery and trace the unfolding of what Flannery O'Connor called a sacramental view of life. I looked up sacrament in the Catholic Encyclopedia, and the Catholic Encyclopedia speaks of sacrament in its broadest sense as, and this is a quote from the Catholic Encyclopedia, sacrament is the sign of something sacred and hidden. The Greek word is mystery, so that the whole world is a vast sacramental system in which material things are, unto men and women, the signs of things spiritual and sacred, even of divinity. And the great 18th century Puritan theologian, Jonathan Edwards, called his journal of nature observations and meditations images or shadows of divine things. Moreover, and this is the real point of my argument, for a fiction writer like O'Connor or a poet like Levertov, language itself takes on a sacramental character and function, as the materiality of words, with their complex and sometimes hidden meanings, become signs through which, but also in which, we discover the mystery of things. The poems and the stories are not just about sacraments, but are themselves sacrament. In Levertov's essays and her wonderful memoir, Tesserae, she reflected on the autobiographical origins of her pilgrimage. Her father, Paul Levertov, was a Russian Hasidic Jew who converted to Christianity and met Beatrice Spooner Jones in Constantinople. They were married in London, and Paul became an Anglican priest active in Jewish-Christian dialogue. One of Paul's ancestors was the well-known Hasidic visionary and scholar Schnauer Zalman. And Beatrice was a descendant of the Welsh visionary Angel Jones of Mold. When Denise married the American writer Mitchell Goodman in the late 40s and came to live in New York, she immersed herself in American culture, so different from the English, and in the poetics of American open form poetry, so different from the English. Under the influence of Robert Creeley, Robert Duncan, and especially William Carlos Williams, she developed her own voice and sense of form. But though at this point she considers herself religiously agnostic, as several of previous speakers have noted, there could be no doubt, even in these poems of the late 50s and 60s, about her fundamentally religious sense of existence. Her seminal essay, Some Notes on Organic Form, which again we heard some discussion of earlier, published in 1965 after a long gestation, was clear about the poet's vocation and about the function of language in expressing, these are her own words, the religious devotion to the truth, to the splendor of the authentic. I love that phrase, the splendor of the authentic. Here is a key passage from the essay. He says, to contemplate comes from templum, temple, a place, a space for observation, marked out by the augur. It means not simply to observe, to regard, but to do these things in the presence of a God. And to meditate is to keep the mind in a state of contemplation. Its synonym is to muse. And to muse comes from a word meaning to stand with open mouth. Not so comical if we think of inspiration, to breathe in. So, as the poet stands open-mouthed in the temple of life, contemplating his experience, there come to him the first words of the poem, the words which are to be his way into the poem, if there is to be a poem. The poem, she says, and we saw that earlier this afternoon, the poet is brought to speech, and she italicizes brought in the essay. Poet is brought to speech, inspired by the experience of the world. As her search in the etymology of words for their hidden meaning indicates, source of contemplate, muse, meditate, and so on. As her search in the etymology of words for their hidden meaning indicates, words are the poet's means of apprehending and participating in mystery. Language links subject and object, poet and world, in the perception of mystery. or as she preferred to say, in the apperception of mystery. That is to say, the conscious recognizing of what we perceive. Levertov's first collection of essays, which included some notes on organic form, she called The Poet in the World. Her first book of poems after coming to the U.S. she called Here and Now, Momentary Miracles of the Ordinary. You have on your handout the first poem, I think, should be a poem called The Ripple. So we're going to look at the text of the Ripple. The Ripple is a kind of still life poem. Notice as we read it how the objects take on distinct material form in the words on the page. The poem is all image. The word image itself is isolated for emphasis in a line of its own. The gradual apprehension of the objects of this little world is all visual until the awed quiet is sublimated in the poet's imagination by the ripple of laughter. Notice, too, as we read the poem, its form and shape, not just the simplicity and directness of the verbal description, but the very arrangement of those words on the page gives the poem its material form and invests the described objects with their shimmering mystery. The short lines play out the sense perceptions in the process of discovery, with the line breaks often scored against the syntactical structure of the sentence. Line breaks in an open form poem, as Levertov learned from Williams, provide, and these are her words again, provide a form of punctuation additional to the punctuation that forms a part of the logic of the completed thoughts. Line breaks, together with the intelligent use of indentation and other devices of scoring, represent a peculiarly poetic, italicized, a peculiarly poetic, alogical, parallel, not competitive punctuation. So here is the image, detail by detail. On white linen, the silk of gray shadows, threefold, overlapping a tau cross. Glass jug and tumblers rise from that which they pass, and luminous in each overcast of cylindrical shade, image of water, of brightness, not gold, not silver, rippling as if with laughter. The careful lineation with pauses at the line breaks enables us to focus and see what might otherwise go unnoticed. The silken gray shadows on the white linen, the solid jug and glasses rising from their cast shadows, the translucent shimmer of jug water, the configuration of the triform shadows, all held in the play of light. The words, many of them monosyllabic, or sense data of real and physical objects, with only two unobtrusive instances of figurative language, the metaphor of the tau cross and the simile of rippling laughter, both registering the poet's apperception or conscious recognition of what she has perceived, apperception of the sacramental aura radiating from those objects, images or shadows of divine things. The light that turns the linen cloth into silk throws the threefold shadows that the poet's imagination sees as a tau cross, sacred symbol in Egyptian mysteries, as well as in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And in the last line, The poet's awed response translates the shimmer of light into the ripple of laughter. In O Taste and See, which should be the next one on your handout, in O Taste and See, the title poem of Levertov's 1964 collection, the primary mode of sense perception is not sight, but as the title says, taste. But again, taste, like sight, becomes an agent of vision in and through the words of the poem and their material shape on the page. The first two lines invert Wordsworth's famous opening of the sonnet on Westminster Bridge, "The world is too much with us." And Levertov breaks those lines to emphasize her inversion, her turning inside out of Wordsworth's dictum. Notice, again, the careful punctuation of line breaks and stanza breaks throughout the poem, as Levertov diffuses the focus of Poem 34 on the Lord into savoring the world around us. So here's the poem. The world is not with us enough. Oh, taste and see, the subway Bible poster said. Meaning the Lord, meaning, if anything, all that lives to the imagination's tongue. Grief, mercy, language, tangerine, weather, to breathe them, bite, savor, chew, swallow, transform into our flesh, our deaths, crossing the street, plum, quince, living in the orchard, and being hungry and plucking the fruit. Yes, she's saying, we know with Wordsworth, and we know with the psalmist that we live in a post-lapsarian world. But instead of escape from or resistance to our fallen Eden, Levertov's injunction is to incorporate as much of it as we can into our brief lives, our flesh, our deaths. Pluck the fruit and eat it. Offspring of Adam and Eve, we should incarnate our mixed experiences into our mortal selves. Oh, taste and thereby see through the tongue. Language, the rhythm and taste of the words, is the substantiation of tasting and seeing. In fact, is the transubstantiation of tasting into seeing. Grief and mercy, life and death are not disembodied concepts or opposed concepts, but individual experiences we all know, as palpable and full of taste and vision to the imagination's tongue as plum and quince and tangerine. In the course of the 60s, grief and violence began to encroach upon and darken Levertov's sense of wonder at the beauty and mystery of the world. Her first political poem was a sequence written during the trial of the Nazi Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. It appeared in the Jacob's Ladder, the collection before O Taste and See. But by the time the Sorrow Dance came out in 1966, after O Taste and See, the change in tone and focus in Levertov's poetry is unmistakable. Personal epiphanies no longer suffice in the world that she saw more and more as riven by war and violence and injustice. The poet was not an individual in a private world, but increasingly she came to see, belong to a community, locally, nationally, even internationally. As American involvement in Vietnam deepened, she and Mitchell Goodman found themselves increasingly involved in the peace movement and public protests against the war. Many poets spoke out against the war and engaged in public protest, but none more actively and urgently than Levertov. And when her English sister Olga, whose life was driven by social activism in various causes, when Olga died in 1964, Levertov's elegy, A Lamentation, and the series of Olga poems that followed signaled her conversion to engagement with the world at a social and political level. The visionary and celebratory poems continued, but what stood out in the Sorrow Dance were the poems for Olga and a final section of poems titled Life at War. These poems opened an argument between Levertov and her beloved friend and mentor, Robert Duncan, an argument that deepened and intensified and finally ruptured their long association in the early 70s. Duncan also was opposed to the Vietnam War, but with increasing forcefulness and increasing high-handedness, he tried to persuade Levertov that her political activism was undermining her visionary imagination and corrupting her sense of language with empty rhetoric and didactic moralisms. She worried about the accuracy of his charges, but precisely on moral grounds, she felt that her imagination had to address a world at war or lose its relevance. War, she told Duncan, could not remain, quote, an empty, and she underscores empty in the letter, an empty word. All our words have to be filled up, be backed by imaginative experience. Could not language envision not only personal insight, but the violence disrupting our communal life? Couldn't language become an agent of political action and social change? She was unsure and moving into unsure territory for herself, but she felt she had to take that risk for the very sake of imagination and language. And her book-long journal poem, Staying Alive, published in 1971, reenacts this dialogue with herself, as at the same time she finds assurance in her new course in the nascent community of fellow activists opposing war and seeking to imagine a just and peaceful society. In a 1991 essay, Levertov traced her political development back to her Judeo-Christian household. Quote, being the child of a socially conscious family, conscience and circumstance virtually forced me into the politics of the anti-war movement of the 1960s and on into the broader anti-nuclear, environmental, and social justice concerns which evolved from it. In the toe-to-toe showdown with Duncan about the possibility of a genuine political poetry, she acknowledged to him the religious basis of her position. This is from one of her letters. An extraordinary exchange that occurs in the early 1970s, which the two of them just battled it out in letters that go on 5, 6, 7 pages. She tells Duncan, people in general have shared this belief, basically, in many times and places, of faith in man's potential, his capacity for goodness, certainly in Christian times at least. The concept of the incarnation is the concept of man's redeemability, however fallen into corruption. For man was made in God's image. Even skeptics and atheists, and she probably would have included herself in that group at this point, even skeptics and atheists cannot help being culturally affected by that concept. What's more, she tells Duncan the anarchist, quote, the concept of the incarnation locates the individual in a community. It means we are members of one another. I've always believed that, she says. Levertov would later admit that while I have never felt that my political commitments were in themselves detrimental to my work, easier to be that clear about it after the fact, I think. The challenge of incorporating politics into poetry is one I have taken up with varying success. Some good poems and some bad ones, no doubt, resulting. Among the very good ones is the poem we looked at in another context earlier, Advent 1966, and that should be in your packet. Advent 1966 engages the strenuous, pained effort to redirect her poetic seeing toward filling the word war with an imagined vision of what it actually means. The language of the poem is punctuated with references to vision, saw, see, eyes, sight, all the way down the poem, as you hear when we read the text. The poem underscores what it sees by setting itself in stark contrast to what Robert Southwell sees in his poem, The Burning Babe. Southwell was an Elizabethan poet, Jesuit priest, martyr, and later canonized saint. And The Burning Babe is a Christmas poem in which Southwell sees the newborn Christ child, aflame in the snowy landscape, burning with the love and passion that will redeem sinful humans. I think I'll take a moment. It's not a long poem. Let me read you the Southwell poem so you can see how she's using her poem as counterpoint to it. So this is Robert Southwell's The Burning Babe. As I in hoary winter's night stood shivering in the snow, surprised I was with sudden heat, which made my heart to glow. And lifting up a fearful eye to view what fire was near, a pretty babe, all burning bright, did in the air appear, who, scorched with excessive heat, such floods of tears did shed, as though his floods should quench his flames, which with his tears were fed. Alas, quoth he, but newly born, in fiery heats I fry. Yet none approach to warm their hearts or feel my fire, but I. My faultless breast the furnace is, the fuel wounding thorns. Love is the fire and sighs the smoke, the ashes shame and scorns. The fuel justice layeth on, and mercy blows the coals. The metal in this furnace wrought are men's defiled souls, for which, as now on fire I am to work them to their good, so will I melt into a bath to wash them in my blood. With this he vanished out of sight and swiftly shrunk away, and straight I called into my mind that it was Christmas Day. See the Elizabethan metaphysical conceit being worked out in that poem. So Levertov's Advent 1966, we all know Advent is the time of the expectant waiting for the coming of the Savior. But you'll hear that Levertov's Advent in Vietnam is a scene of senseless suffering without end, seemingly, or without redemption. Here's the text of Advent 1966. Because in Vietnam, the vision of a burning babe is multiplied, the flesh on fire, not Christ, as Southwell saw it, prefiguring the passion upon the eve of Christmas, but wholly human and repeated, infant after infant, their names forgotten, their sex unknown in the ashes, set alight, flaming but not vanishing as his vision, but lingering, cinders upon the earth, or living on, moaning and stinking in hospitals 3 a bed. Because of this my strong sight, my clear caressive sight, my poet's sight I was given, that it might stir me to song, is blurred. There is a cataract filming over my inner eyes, or else a monstrous insect has entered my head and looks out from my sockets with multiple vision, seeing not the unique holy infant, burning sublimely, an imagination of redemption, furnace in which souls are wrought into new life, but as off a belt line, more senseless figures aflame. And this insect, who is not there, it is my own eyes do the seeing. The insect is not there. What I see is there. Will not permit me to look elsewhere. Or if I look, to see except dulled and unfocused, the delicate, firm, whole flesh of the still unburned. The poem's longer than the ripple or O taste and see, and so are the lines. And they need to be, as Denise's imagination struggles against its natural inclinations to encompass and speak the all but unspeakable horror of what she imagines in Vietnam. What's more, these rhythms and lines are differently but no less organically and skillfully scored than in the previous poems of celebration. Here the imagination's tongue is put to the ultimate test. Its words stretch into long, loose, meandering sentences as they circle the image uneasily again and again, like the helicopters raining napalm on the innocent. They turn back on themselves, bumping haltingly from phrase to repeated phrase. The alliterations catch the incomprehensible contradictions in what she sees. Vietnam vision, burning babe, flesh on fire, holy human with its pun on holy. The succession of present participles renders the ongoing immediacy of the suffering, flaming but not vanishing but lingering, living, moaning, and stinking. And the repeated words press home the scope of the tragedy. Burning, fire, flaming, burning, still unburned, multiplied, multiple, repeated, holy human, whole flesh, infant after infant, not vanishing. In self-defense, the poet invokes metaphors to distance and disengage what she sees. She says a cataract clouds her vision. A monstrous insect has invaded her sight. But she quickly discards those contrivances to confront the fact that what she imagines is true fact, is there, and is still consuming infant after infant. The anguished language and outcry in poems like Advent's 1966 may constitute less sacramental revelation than prophetic witness, but they proceed, as Levertov told Duncan, from a conviction that the incarnate sacredness, they proceed from a conviction of the incarnate sacredness of the individual life and of the human community. During those years of personal and political upheaval and change, Levertov gathered strength and confirmation in the fellowship of other activists, and particularly in the witness of people like Dorothy Day, Daniel Berrigan, Thomas Merton, for whom theological commitment predicated political commitment. Levertov's essay, A Poet's View, published in 1984, traces the quickening of her religious sensibility over the previous decade. Looking back to her early poems and to the poetics articulated in some notes on organic form, she recognizes that she had felt from the outside that, quote, the concept of inspiration presupposes a power that enters the individual and is not a personal attribute. And recently, she says, that power, quote, began to be defined for me as God, and further, as God revealed in the Incarnation. Consequently, she goes on to say, in the matter of religion, I have moved in the last few years from a regretful skepticism which sought some measure of relief, which sought relief in some measure of pantheism, while it acknowledged both the ethical and emotional influence of my Jewish Christian roots and early education, to a position of Christian belief. It's a complicated sentence and I bungled it in the middle, so I'll read it again. In the matter of religion, I have moved in the last few years from a regretful skepticism which sought relief in some measure of pantheism, while it acknowledged both the ethical and emotional influence of my Jewish Christian roots and an early education, close parenthesis. We were talking earlier about her parenthetical self-corrections. Moved from that to a position of Christian belief. The agnostic pantheism of earlier poems like O Taste and See has been subsumed in the mystery of the Incarnation. Levertov sequence Mass for the Day of St. Thomas Didymus, which we were just hearing about, first published as a chapbook in 1981 and included in the 1982 collection Candles in Babylon, is a dramatic marker in her work because it turned out to be a poem of conversion. She conceived the poem, she tells us, as a sequence using the traditional parts of the liturgy, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Benedictus, Agnus Dei, for an agnostic Mass for doubting Thomas. However, quote, a few months later when I arrived at the Agnus Dei, I discovered myself to be in a different relation to the material and to the liturgical form from that. I've discovered myself to be in a different relation to the material and to the liturgical form from that in which I had begun. The experience of writing the poem, that long swim through waters of unknown depth, the experience of writing the poem had been also a conversion process, if you will. The invocations, as we saw, of the deity in the Mass move from, O thou deep, remote unknown, to thou unknown I know, and the known, unknown, unknowable. The decisive transition from unknown to known comes, in my reading of the poem, at the end of the Benedictus, when she says, the Word chose to become flesh. In the blur of flesh, we bow, baffled. Then the Agnus Dei comes to complete the poem, and we heard it. We read it, and we heard it sung at lunch. Levertov was raised an Anglican, and in the 80s, she began to worship in various churches where she said, I discover spiritual fellowship and an active commitment to my political values. And in 1990, she chose to be received into the Roman Catholic community. The volumes of poems in the 1980s and 90s still contain political poems, opposing violence and oppression, opposing the rape of God's created earth, advocating peace and justice, care for the earth, but also more and more poems with religious and explicitly Christian concerns. The last books Levertov put together before she died were two collections comprised of poems from her previous books, pocket-sized for greater portability, and published just months before her death in December 1997. They're lovely little books. The Life Around Us, selected poems on nature, and the second one is called The Stream and the Sapphire, selected poems on religious themes. Already suffering from the lymphoma that took her life, she obviously intended the two collections as a kind of summary and synthesis of her life's work. Passage is the last poem in a sequence called Of God and of the Gods in the collection Oblique Prayers, 1984. The lines are again longish for Levertov, but here, in contrast to the halting movement of Advent 1966, listen to the slow, steady, smooth movement of these lines as they are scored to catch the long, unbroken, sustaining sweep of spirit blowing through the natural world. The sound and movement of the words on the page turn description into sacrament. The poem consists of 4 sets of tercets, 4 sets of 3 lines, and they modulate the interchangeable meanings of the Latin spiritus as spirit, wind, breath, divine, divinity, nature, humanity. Its sweep embraces all human history, extending the Ruach, God's breath, over the primordial waters in Genesis to the immediate spring moment of the here and now. This is explicitly a poem of inspiration. The poet breathes in the spirit of the landscape and breathes out the poem. Unlike the earlier Levertov poems, the lines here are mostly end-stopped rather than enjambed, measuring the regular intake and expulsion of breath. Listen as the first 2 end-stop tercets yield to the single sentence that expands through the tercets that comprise the second half of the poem. As the words slip along, notice how differently the alliteration and repetition function here from their effect in Advent 1966. Listen in the persistent sibilant sounds, the S sounds, for the quiet passage of wind. Watch out for reiterations of words and variations on words and syllables that spell out the continuity of the movement. Here then is the text of passage. The Spirit that walked upon the face of the waters walks the meadow of long grass. Green shines to silver where the Spirit passes. Wind from the compass points, sun at meridian. These are the forms the Spirit enters: breath, ruach, light that is witness and by which we witness. The grasses numberless, bowing and rising, silently cry Hosanna as the Spirit moves over them and moves burnishing over and over upon mountain pastures. A day of spring, a needle's eye, space and time are passing through like a swath of silk. The alliteration of initial W's, walked, waters, walks, wind, becomes concentrated in the middle line where breathing metamorphoses into seeing. Breath becomes light that is witness and by which we witness. The first syllable of the title passage, pass, blows through the poem as passage, grass, passes, compass, grasses, pastures, all the way to the passing in the last line. The sibilant S sounds in every line build to the miraculous sense in the last line that all space and time are passing through this spring day like a swath of silk. The poem becomes the needle's eye through which time and space pass. So we've followed Levertov from the silken shadows that form a tau cross to the silken passage of spirit through the natural world. The incarnation implicit in Levertov's poetry from the start becomes the central concern of her later volumes. Sands of the Well, published in 1996, the year before her death, was the last volume of new poems that Levertov organized with her usual care for the shape and balance of the collection. On Belief in the Physical Resurrection of Jesus, which you should have on your handout, comes toward the end of that volume. Levertov's early mentor, William Carlos Williams, who taught her more about language and the language and form of poems than anyone, remained with her during the years in which she moved so decisively away from Williams' secular, anti-metaphysical viewpoint. But in the 1980s, she was still writing about Williams, thinking about Williams. She wrote several essays about Williams' example as a poet. And in the poem On Belief in the Physical Resurrection of Jesus, she adopted the form that Williams invented and adopted in his late poems as the most flexible and expressive measure for the unmetered verses of open form poetry. Namely, tercets are triads of lines of widely varying length and number of stresses, he called them variable feet, spaced down the page with stepped indentations to give the words ample space all around them to register and to resonate. We'll read the text of the poem, but this, I wanted to point out, as Donna told us before, that the second line is a quotation from Marianne Moore, and from Marianne Moore's poem called Poetry, which rejects poets who exalt language to disembodied concepts and airy abstractions, or reduce language to mere semantic signs and symbols. Levertov's metaphor for such poets in the poem is epiphytes, air plants that live like moss on the atmosphere. In her poem, Moore proposes instead that poets be literalists of the imagination, whose words are grounded in the materiality of the world. Levertov has, of course, all along been a literalist of the imagination, and so was Williams, whose dictum was no ideas but in things. So this poem brings Levertov full circle back to Williams, but with the incarnational vision that she arrived at on her pilgrimage. So here's the text of the poem. It is for all literalists of the imagination, poets or not, that miracle is possible and essential. Are some intricate minds nourished on concept as epiphytes flourish high in the canopy? Can they subsist on the light, on the half of metaphor that's not grounded in dust, grit, heavy, carnal clay? Do signs contain and utter for them all the reality that they need? Resurrection for them, an internal power, but not a matter of flesh. For the others, of whom I am one, miracles, ultimate need, bread of life, are miracles just because people so tuned to the humdrum laws, gravity, mortality, can't open to symbols' power unless convinced of its ground, its roots in bone and blood. We must feel the pulse in the wound to believe that with God all things are possible. Taste bread at Emmaus, that warm hands broke and blessed. As with Williams' late triadic poems, the openness of the form here allows Levertov a certain prosy discursiveness that suddenly coalesces in the images melding those two resurrection moments. Thomas knowing the risen Christ by touching his wounds. The disciples at Emmaus recognizing him in the breaking of the bread. Oh, taste and see. But now, taste the Lord, the incarnate God, whose miraculous rising informs all the miracles of daily life. The acknowledgement and celebration of mystery, we heard Levertov say at the beginning of my talk, was her governing theme. And primary wonder is the poem that she chose and placed to close Sands of the Well. The poem is a kind of loose and inverted, unrhymed sonnet with sestet before the octave. It breaks in the middle and shifts in the middle like a sonnet. The courtly charade of metaphors in the opening sestet, banished by the awed prayer of the octave. So here is primary wonder. Days pass when I forget the mystery. Problems soluble and problems offering their own ignored solutions jostle for my attention. They crowd its antechamber, along with a host of diversions, my courtiers, wearing their colored clothes, cap and bells. Then, and there's the volta of the sonnet, the turn of the sonnet. And then, once more, the quiet mystery is present to me. The throng's clamor recedes, the mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything, rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still honor hour by hour, sustain it. At the end of the essay, A Poet's View, Levertov writes, I would say that the imagination, which synergizes intellect, emotion, and instinct, is the perceptive organ through which it is possible, though not inevitable, to experience God. I'll read that sentence again. It's so tightly written and so crucial for it. I would say, and she's thinking of, in the past, if you know that essay, she's just quoted Wallace Stevens saying God and the imagination are one. And she says something like, Williams may mean that, you know, that we've made a God out of the imagination, or that the God is a figment of the imagination. But I would say that the imagination, which synergizes intellect, emotion, and instinct, is the perceptive organ through which it is possible, though not inevitable, to experience God. If and when that happens, and I think it happened often enough in Levertov's work, then the material words of the poem, not just their meaning, but their sound and shape and movement, constitute the sacramental manifestation of that moment's grace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al, very much. We'll have an hour to unpack Al's beautiful speech, his plenary address, his celebration of Denise. We can do one or two here, and then we'll invite Mark and Missy up. We do want to honor the conversation and keep it nourished by some immediate responses. Anybody have anything they want to say or ask or comment about Al's address?
I left you speechless. Well, Yes, I knew you would have one.
Al, I'm so grateful for this. As such a teacher and of poetry, and there's such a deep care and attention to what's happening in the dynamics of the words and the lines, the S's. I never saw those S's before. I just never saw them before. You just open our eyes. Or at least I'm not in the same place of seeing, so I need your eyes to see this. And I just love
Oh, taste and see.
and try to see.
I think it was Northrop Frye said that literature tries to become a single, all-encompassing thing, and many authors' work moves towards that. I'm seeing John Hassler, the Minnesota novelist, all of it's becoming a chronicle of northern Minnesota. But in Primary Wonder, I see a summation of some of the things we saw earlier today. Let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything rather than void. That's Julian, that's the After Mind Walk, that's so many of the others. It's like she just keeps rolling them all together. Each one unique, but each one kind of summing up what came before.
Yes.
No, I just found it so interesting. You said the poem is sacrament, and then how language actually works and the imagination. And the theologian I worked with yesterday, Johann Baptist Metz, he says that if he would have had a decision to say how theology should be written, he would have done it in poetry, because that's actually the only way how you can do theology that is appropriate to the mystery. So I just thought that how you were setting it up and how language is really the way how we connect with the divine mystery is very interesting. And then if you think of Dei Verbum, this Vatican II document on the Word of God,
Yeah.
in the opening, very important parts, it goes into that direction, even though it then doesn't follow on with it, but it has the intuition that language actually is not only something additional to the revelation, but that actually through language.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
That's right. And there's, reading Levertov, you see how she does it. Other poets do it different ways, but yes. David?
We'll take one more, and it's David. Thanks. A bird doesn't fly on one wing, David.
Now
The subtext of Primary Wonder is nothing, is that nothing would exist. And that's the witness that informs all of Denise's work, is that it's all pitched on the brink of oblivion. And I think that's why she's the most courageous person I've ever met, because she never blinked on the possibility that nothing is a possible outcome.
And she obviously placed that poem at the end of and she must have known she was pretty close to the end by the time she put that book.
Thanks again, Al. I'm going to hand it over here now to Father Mark Bosco and Missy Bradshaw for some closing remarks. Let's hear it, though, for Al Gelpi.
Okay, so we're going to say just a few comments, and then Al wants to take us one more time back through a poem. So,
okay, so I wanted to thank all of you for coming. When Mark Bosco brought me onto this project a year ago, it was already well underway, so I want to thank the organizing committee for letting me join them, for making space for me. Our organizing committee was Ed Block, Mike Murphy, Kevin Burke, Al Gelpi, and Steve Schlesinger, who is not able to be with us And I'd like to thank them for all their work. I want to thank the plenarists who started out as dreams that we hoped would come, for giving this shape. And of course to the panelists who brought your insights and analyses and imagination to make this take shape in ways that we can't possibly have imagined when we first started putting this together. And of course to the poets and to the musicians who made this so much more than a regular academic conference. This was so special. So thank you for making it truly interdisciplinary and aesthetically beautiful. Thank you to Mark for inviting me to be a part of this. What a pleasure it was to learn from all of you throughout this past year.
Really, we couldn't have done this without Missy, so I really do appreciate you coming on board and just really being excited. What I loved about working with Missy is she would report back about how she was with emails with you, and she'd say, these are the nicest people in academia I've ever met. They're like, what do you want me to do? I'll do it. I've never, you said this over and over to me, and I thought there was...
I work on Amy Lowell, and nobody likes Amy Lowell. Everybody loves Denise. So all this passion, you don't have to fight anybody, you just like her, was really mind-blowing.
So it was really a wonderful, and really just the organizational stuff. I wanted to say a couple of things. I do want to thank everybody too for coming. I want to thank, many ways, again, as I said before, it was Kevin's visit here a few years ago, and again, we were in some conversation, and we both heard each other say we had to do this. And so I really thank you, Kevin, for the plenary. Alberto Caramia, thank you very much. Just really appreciate that. I want you to know, though, that the structure of this couldn't have happened without Gabby and John, wherever they are. I wouldn't know what to do at the Center for the Hanks Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage without them. They really keep the thing rolling and keep me on task and make me laugh and tell me when I should stop doing what I'm doing. So, so I really appreciate that. Very good. Al wants to read a poem, and we have some champagne that we're going to pour in just a second because it is Denise's birthday. And after the poem, we're going to have Delia come up to lead us in Happy Birthday, but hopefully by that time we'll have all gotten. So after this poem, we'll kind of go get some drinks. We'll all hold them, hopefully, wine, beer, whatever we hold, and then we'll sing Happy Birthday to her, okay? Yeah.
This is a short poem, and I thought it was a good gloss on a lot of what's been said for the last 2 days. And it's an early poem of Denise, a fairly early poem of Denise. It's called Overland to the Islands, and it's a wonderful gloss on her description of her pilgrim's path, not in soaring terms, but in terms of the splendor of the authentic of daily life. And I'm reading this poem out of a lovely little anthology of Denise's poems, bilingual edition that Christina Gomez and her colleague Bernd Dietz did. And I have it at hand, and that's what I'm using. So overland to the islands. Let's go, much as that dog goes, intently haphazard. The Mexican light on the day that smells like autumn in Connecticut makes iris ripples on his black gleaming fur. And that, too, is as one would desire, a radiance, consorting with the dance. Under his feet, rocks and mud, his imagination sniffing, engaged in its perceptions, dancing edgeways. There's nothing the dog disdains on his way. Nevertheless, he keeps moving, changing pace and approach, but not direction. Every step an arrival.